on now into the third dimension of vulnerability, which is adaptive capacity. And you'll remember that's essentially around the capacity of those within an adaptive system to respond to the challenges that climate change poses for them. And if adaptive capacity is low, then the ability to adapt will be much lower, and an adaptation may not actually occur at all. Within this context, cities themselves are very complex entities. So governance and government are a critical aspect of adaptive capacity within cities to deal with these complex multiple risks that they're exposed to. So without the right institutional and policy environment that a well-governed city can provide, adaptation will be much more difficult. So you need to create this enabling environment for adaptation to occur. And that requires, within a city, good politics, so that you have, which leads to essentially effective decision-making, and a well-equipped and effective civil service. We need up-to-date regulations and policies that are fit for the present-day risks and the future risks that will emerge. And then you need effective implementation of those policies. And then finally, we need capacities to support those implementations. And that's both human capacity, the skills of the people within government and other responding entities, but also financial capacity. Without the finances to be able to respond, then adaptation won't happen. The problem for many African cities is that they sit at the low end of the spectrum globally in this regard. Many African cities have low levels of governance, are poorly managed, and are financially stressed. So they have low capacity to respond to the climate change challenge. We also need to think about adaptive capacity at the household level. So that's really around individual people and families, and maybe the communities within which they live, and civil society. And again, in an African context, individuals have generally low adaptive capacity. Most individuals living in cities are relatively poor by global standards and even by national standards, relatively low education levels, so unable to access and process information about climate risks and find out about adaptation options, and also the high levels of informality within urban settlements means that there's very low adaptive capacity there as well, because of the nature of the informality. So overall, individuals in African cities also have low adaptive capacity, which makes individual actions much harder in a climate change setting. The final dimension of adaptive capacity I wanted to talk about was in the commercial sector in urban areas. We have one characteristic of African cities is the many hundreds and thousands of small businesses that operate there. And that's everything from a small grocery store in the backyard of a house through to all the small businesses that are scattered around a typical African city. And because they're small, the capacity to respond to climate risks is very small as well. And so they're much more vulnerable in the sense of having low adaptive capacity. And even if one looks at larger businesses in African cities, they tend to have weaker corporate governance. They tend to have working in a weaker regulatory environment. And so issues around sustainability and risk management are not at the forefront of their thinking, and so their adaptive capacity is also limited. And then even for international companies that are located in African cities, often the standards that are applied by those companies in developed country worlds are much more lax and relaxed in developing countries. And so the consistency of corporate governance with these multinational countries is not equal between developing and developed countries. So pulling all of this together around the vulnerability of African cities to climate change, we can see that cities in Africa occur in a very similar range of geographical and climate risk settings to other global cities. So they have similar exposures. There's not much difference. The big difference is their higher sensitivity and their lower adaptive capacity. And these two factors combine to make African urban areas much more vulnerable to climate change, and the adaptation gap, much, much larger. And then finally, African cities, along with many cities in developing countries, have this particular dynamic that they're rapidly growing as population grows and as the rural to urban transition actually happens in developing countries. So in addition to being particularly sensitive, they're also growing fast and have a large catch-up to do in terms of continually trying to cope with expanding informal settlements.